My name is Claire, and I'm a young attorney living in Washington, D.C. I've always been a rational person, someone who believes in facts and evidence. My career demands it. In the courtroom, there's no place for superstition or irrational fears. I recently moved into a charming apartment in an old, historic building downtown. It had character, the kind of place where you could imagine the walls holding stories from decades past. The first few weeks in my new home were uneventful. I was busy with work, settling into my routine. But then, something changed. Started as a vague feeling, like an itch you can't scratch. Whenever I was in the apartment, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, an awareness that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was just the stress of my job or the adjustment to a new place. But the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Then the disturbances began. They were small things, things that could easily be explained away. A book would be out of place on the shelf. A cupboard door left open when I was sure I had closed it. Once, I found my keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook by the door where I always left them. At night, the sense of being watched intensified. I would lie in bed, heart pounding, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow more sinister. Sleep became elusive, my mind racing with irrational fears. I started leaving lights on, hoping the brightness would chase away whatever was lurking in the darkness. One evening, as I was working late on a case, I heard a distinct whisper. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear. The whisper came again, a soft, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from just beyond the walls. My heart raced, and I jumped up, checking every room, every corner, but found nothing. I was left standing in the middle of my living room, a cold sweat running down my back. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was the neighbors, or perhaps the wind howling through the old windows. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. This was more than just my imagination. Something was watching me, and whatever it was getting bolder. The first truly undeniable event happened on a quiet Sunday evening. I was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables in the kitchen, when I heard a loud thud from the living room. My heart skipped a beat, but I took a deep breath and walked over to investigate. To my shock, the large mirror that hung above my fireplace had fallen, shattering into countless pieces on the floor. The hooks that had held the mirror were still firmly in place. There was no logical reason for it to have fallen. I cleaned up the mess, telling myself it must have been a freak accident, perhaps a structural issue with the wall. But as I swept up the glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident. In the days that followed, the disturbances grew more frequent. I would come home from work to find furniture moved or personal items out of place. A book I had left on the coffee table would be on the kitchen counter. My laptop would be powered on when I distinctly remembered shutting it down. One evening, I found a cabinet door in the kitchen wide open, its contents disheveled as if someone had rummaged through them. At night, the noises became almost unbearable. Footsteps echoed through the apartment, heavy and deliberate. But whenever I summoned the courage to investigate, there was no one there. I could hear the faint sound of whispering, words just out of reach, impossible to understand but unmistakably there. I tried to rationalize these occurrences. I told myself that I was tired, overworked, maybe even sleepwalking. The logical side of my brain clung to any plausible explanation, but the fear was growing, gnawing at my sanity. I began to dread coming home. The place that was supposed to be my sanctuary now felt like a trap. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise that froze my blood. It was the sound of my bedroom door slowly creaking open. My eyes snapped open, and I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. The door continued to open until it hit the wall with a soft thud. I could feel a presence in the room, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing down on me. I reached over to turn on the bedside lamp, but the bulb flickered and died, plunging the room into deeper darkness. Panic set in, and I grabbed my phone, using its light to scan the room. There was nothing there, no one hiding in the shadows. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. I slept with the lights on after that, every creak and groan of the old building sending shivers down my spine. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Rational explanations were slipping away, and the realization that I might be dealing with something beyond my understanding was terrifying. I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to feel safe in my own home again. With my nerves frayed and sleep a distant memory, I decided I needed to dig deeper into the history of my building. I spent an entire weekend at the local library, sifting through old newspapers and public records, hoping to find anything that could explain the strange occurrences in my apartment. What I found was more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. The building had a dark and tragic past, one that seemed to linger in its very walls. It was built in the early 1900s and had been home to numerous residents over the decades, many of whom had reported similar experiences of unease and terror. One name in particular kept appearing in my research: Daniel Roth. He had lived in the building during the 1970s and was known for his reclusive and eccentric behavior. Roth was a historian with a morbid fascination for the occult. Neighbors often heard strange chants and saw unusual symbols scrawled on his walls. One chilling detail that stood out was that several of his neighbors had gone missing, their bodies never found, and Roth had been the prime suspect. However, there was never enough evidence to charge him. Roth himself disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving his apartment abandoned and filled with bizarre artifacts and books on dark rituals. The more I read about him, the more the pieces of my own puzzle seemed to fall into place. The disturbances in my apartment felt eerily similar to the accounts of those who lived near Roth. Intrigued and terrified, I sought out people who had lived in the building longer than I had. I spoke with an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been there for over 30 years. She recounted stories of previous tenants who had fled in the middle of the night, convinced they were being haunted by something sinister. She also mentioned a young couple who had lived in my apartment before me. They had endured months of torment before finally moving out, leaving behind most of their belongings in their haste. Mrs. Hawthorne's stories were unsettling. She described seeing shadowy figures in the hallways and hearing cries for help when no one was there. She spoke of doors that would slam shut on their own and mirrors that shattered without warning. Her accounts matched my experiences almost perfectly. One detail she mentioned stuck with me. Daniel Roth had performed a ritual in the basement of the building just before he disappeared. According to legend, he had tried to summon a spirit or entity to grant him eternal knowledge. Whether he succeeded or not was unclear, but many believed that whatever he had summoned had remained trapped in the building, tormenting its residents ever since. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I knew I was dealing with something far beyond the ordinary, something that had been festering in the building for decades. I needed to find a way to protect myself, to rid my apartment of whatever malevolent presence was haunting me. But as I delved deeper into the building's past, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a darkness that I might not be able to escape. After discovering the building's dark past, the disturbances in my apartment only grew more intense and frequent. It was as if my research had awakened something malevolent. Every night, the sense of dread deepened, and the events that followed were far worse than anything I had experienced before. The footsteps I had once heard at a distance now echoed loudly, pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I would lie in bed, heart pounding, as the doorknob rattled violently, threatening to open. I began to experience vivid nightmares, dreams so real that I would wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. In these dreams, I was always trapped in my apartment, running from a shadowy figure that seemed to delight in my terror. One particularly horrifying night, I woke to find the words, "Help me," scrawled across my bedroom wall in what looked like blood. My scream echoed through the apartment as I stumbled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. The message was fresh, the blood still wet. I frantically checked the entire apartment, but there was no sign of an intruder. The doors were locked and the windows were secure. I was alone, yet the evidence of someone or something else was undeniable. The next morning, I tried to clean the wall, but the message wouldn't fade. No matter how hard I scrubbed, the words remained, a constant reminder of my growing fear. That same day, I found strange symbols carved into the wood of my dining table. They were intricate and unfamiliar, resembling the occult markings I had seen in the books about Daniel Roth. It felt as if the entity was trying to communicate with me, to break down my sanity piece by piece. My daily life became a waking nightmare. Objects would fly across the room, propelled by an unseen force. The lights would flicker and die, plunging me into darkness at the most unexpected moments. Whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the night. They followed me everywhere, mocking and taunting me. I started to hear my name being called in an eerie, distorted voice. Desperation drove me to seek help, but my pleas were met with skepticism and pity. Friends and family thought I was succumbing to stress and overwork. Even a paranormal investigator, whom I finally convinced to visit, left without witnessing anything substantial, dismissing my claims as overactive imagination. Left with no other option, I decided to document everything. I set up cameras throughout the apartment, hoping to capture the disturbances on film. The footage I reviewed was horrifying. Doors opening and closing on their own, objects moving without explanation, and, most chilling of all, a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed as I slept. Its face was obscured, but its presence was unmistakable. My fear reached a tipping point when I woke one night to find myself unable to move. Sleep paralysis had gripped me, and as I lay there, helpless, the shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It leaned over me, its breath cold and rancid against my skin. In that moment, I was certain I would die, that the entity would consume me entirely. But just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me gasping for air. I knew then that I couldn't go on like this. I had to find a way to end the torment, to reclaim my life and sanity. The realization that I was alone in this battle was both terrifying and empowering. If I was to survive, I would have to confront the darkness head-on, to face whatever horrors awaited me in the depths of my haunted apartment. By the time I decided to reach out for help, I was already teetering on the edge of sanity. The terror in my apartment had become unbearable, and I knew I couldn't face it alone any longer. My first call was to my parents. I explained everything, my voice trembling as I recounted the horrific events. They listened patiently but ultimately suggested that I was overworked and stressed. They urged me to take a break, maybe even visit them for a few days to clear my head. Next, I turned to my closest friends. I invited them over one evening, hoping that their presence would somehow quell the disturbances or at least provide me with some much-needed support. But as I described the nightly horrors, I saw the same look in their eyes, a mix of concern and doubt. They suggested rational explanations. Old buildings creak, stress can cause vivid dreams, and perhaps I was simply imagining things. Their skepticism was like a dagger to my already fragile psyche. Desperate for validation, I reached out to a paranormal investigator. I found a reputable one through an online forum dedicated to the supernatural. He arrived with an array of equipment and a confident demeanor. For hours, he roamed my apartment, taking readings and setting up cameras. I watched with bated breath, hoping he would find something concrete, something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. But after a thorough investigation, he found nothing definitive. "Sometimes the mind can play tricks on us," he said gently as he packed up his gear. "It might be worth talking to a therapist." Feeling more isolated than ever, I even consulted a therapist, hoping that maybe they could offer some insight or relief. The sessions were helpful in managing my anxiety, but they didn't stop the haunting. Each night, the entity made its presence known, and each night, I felt my sanity slipping further away. The realization that I was truly alone in this battle hit me hard. No one believed me, and I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I would have been skeptical too. But the terror I faced was real, and I knew I had to confront it on my own. There was no escaping it, no running away. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I needed to reclaim it from the darkness that had invaded. Determined to find a solution, I immersed myself in research once again. I revisited the books and articles about Daniel Roth, looking for any clues that might help me. I found references to ancient cleansing rituals and protective symbols. I spent hours meticulously drawing these symbols and placing them around my apartment, hoping they would offer some protection. As I prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation, I felt a strange sense of resolve. The fear was still there, but it was now accompanied by a fierce determination. This entity had taken so much from me, my peace, my sanity, my sense of security. It was time to take it all back. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I had no guarantee of success, but I had to try. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. With my apartment covered in protective symbols and armed with the knowledge I had gathered, I braced myself for the battle ahead. The nights were still filled with terror, but now, there was also a flicker of defiance within me. I was no longer just a victim. I was a fighter, ready to face the darkness that had haunted me for far too long. The night of the final confrontation, the atmosphere in my apartment was thick with tension. I had spent hours preparing, placing protective symbols in every room and lighting candles to create a barrier of light. I stood in the middle of my living room, clutching an ancient text I had found during my research, filled with incantations meant to banish malevolent spirits. My heart pounded in my chest, but I was resolute. It was time to face whatever had been tormenting me. As midnight approached, the temperature in the apartment dropped sharply, and an oppressive silence fell over the rooms. I felt a presence growing stronger, more palpable, as if the very walls were closing in on me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I could hear the whispers again, louder and more menacing, as if they were right beside me. With trembling hands, I began to recite the incantations. The words felt foreign and powerful on my tongue, echoing through the silent apartment. As I spoke, the whispers grew louder, morphing into angry, guttural growls. The candles flickered violently, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Then I saw it. The shadowy figure from my nightmares materialized in the corner of the room. It was more distinct than ever, its form shifting and pulsating as if made of darkness itself. The air grew thick with a rancid, suffocating odor. I forced myself to keep chanting, even as my voice wavered with fear. The entity moved closer, its eyes glowing a sinister red. It seemed to feed off my fear, growing more substantial with each passing second. I could see its face now, a grotesque, twisted visage that bore an expression of pure malice. This was no ordinary ghost. This was Daniel Roth, or at least what he had become after his failed ritual. His thirst for eternal knowledge had transformed him into a vengeful spirit, bound to the building and fueled by the suffering of its inhabitants. As he approached, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, sending waves of icy terror through my body. My voice faltered, but I forced myself to continue the incantation. The symbols around the room began to glow faintly, reacting to the power of the words. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its hold on this plane. Roth's face contorted with rage, and he lunged at me, his form dissolving into a swirling mass of darkness. I felt a crushing pressure around my chest, as if he were trying to suffocate me. Gasping for breath, I continued to chant, focusing all my willpower on the words. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, filling the room with an otherworldly light. With a final, desperate push, I shouted the last lines of the incantation. The room erupted in blinding light, and Roth let out a blood-curdling scream. His form disintegrated, the darkness dissipating like smoke in the wind. The oppressive weight lifted, and I collapsed to the floor, panting and trembling. For a moment, the apartment was silent. Then, slowly, the lights flickered back on, and the temperature returned to normal. I looked around, half expecting the entity to reappear, but there was nothing. The symbols had done their job. The ritual had worked. Daniel Roth was gone, his spirit banished from this world. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I sat in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the remnants of my battle. The fear that had gripped me for so long was finally beginning to ebb, replaced by a sense of profound relief. I had faced the darkness and survived. My apartment, my sanctuary, was mine once more. In the days that followed, the disturbances ceased entirely. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I began to feel safe in my home again. The experience had changed me, left its mark on my soul, but it also taught me the power of courage and resilience. I had faced an unimaginable horror and emerged victorious. Though the nightmares occasionally still haunt my sleep, I now know that I have the strength to confront them. My apartment, once a place of fear, is now a testament to my survival. And as I move forward, I carry with me the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way to fight back and reclaim the light. Enjoyed it? Give a like and spread the terror. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any scares. Join our dark community.